So the cast and crew of Star Trek The Next Generation warps onto the big screen for the very first time, and teams up with Captain James T. Kirk in this highly debated about entry in the Star Trek franchise. So let's get into all the analysis and production problems of Star Trek Generations. In the 23rd century, the retired Captain James T. Kirk, along with former shipmates Montgomery Scott and Pavel Chekhov, toured the newly christened USS Enterprise B. However, on its maiden cruise, Captain John Harriman is forced to respond to a distress call, while understaffed and under-equipped. The new crew attempts to rescue a pair of ships carrying El-Orion refugees from a violent energy ribbon, but after losing one ship, Harriman enlists the experience of Captain Kirk to save the remaining lives. Yet after being a handful of refugees on board, they become trapped by the ribbon. With no photon torpedoes aboard, Kirk volunteers to go manually modify the main deflector dish in order to break them free. However, the now saved ship is then struck by the ribbon, seemingly killing the legendary Starfleet captain. 78 years later, the crew of the USS Enterprise D celebrate the promotion of Security Officer Worf to Lieutenant Commander on a holodeck sailing vessel. However, amidst this, Captain Jean-Luc Picard receives distressing news, while the crew is called to action by a distress signal from the Amagosa Observatory. The scientific outpost was apparently attacked by Romulans, leaving only a few survivors, including Dr. Tolian Soren, who alongside Guinan was previously among the refugees rescued by the Enterprise B. Meanwhile, following a misjudged attempt at humor with Dr. Crusher on the holodeck, the android did as Lieutenant Commander Geordi LaForge installed the emotion chip that his creator Dr. Nudian Singh made for him. The results spark a strongly humorous reaction, but when Data and Geordi return to the observatory, the chip severely malfunctions and incapacitates Data when Geordi is assaulted by Dr. Soren. Meanwhile, Counselor Deanna Troi visits with Captain Picard and discovers that his brother Robert and nephew Rene perished in the fire, leaving him as the only living Picard in the bloodline. Yet his grief is halted when Soren launches a probe into the Amagosa star, which will cause it to explode within a matter of minutes. The attempt to rescue Data and LaForge is hindered when a Klingon bird of prey decloaks and takes Soren and captive Geordi away. The away team of the Enterprise then manage to escape, just ahead of the destructive Shockwave. The renegade Klingons Lursa and Betor reveal they've been promised a powerful weapon by Soren, fueled by trilithium stolen from the Romulans, that he's using for a personal purpose. Guinan reveals to Picard that the energy ribbon is a nexus that exists outside of space and time, granting those who enter it a reality of pure joy. With his family and home taken from him by the Borg, all Soren wants is to return to the Nexus. Picard and Data discover that Soren is destroying stars in order to alter the gravitational trajectory of the Nexus towards the Viridian system, where civilizations of millions could be wiped out if he continues on this path. The Enterprise crew attempts to prevent this, but treachery and subterfuge by the Duras sisters ends up crippling the Federation flagship, which soon crashes into Viridian 3, while Picard's attempts to avert Soren's plans fail. The star explodes, the Nexus takes both Dr. Soren and Captain Picard, and the planet is destroyed. Picard soon awakens in a lush Christmas fantasy, reunited with his nephew, and joined by an imaginary family he never had. Yet a past echo of Guinan pulls him out of the illusion, knowing he needs to leave the Nexus and slip back in time to stop Soren. Yet unable to do it alone, Guinan leads him to Captain James T. Kirk, who was taken to the Nexus after saving the Enterprise B. Now two captains from generations apart will have to join forces in order to change history, in order to save the future. So Star Trek The Next Generation ran for 178 episodes over 7 seasons, from 1987 up to 1994, and became one of the most popular and successful syndicated series of all time, racking up numerous Emmy nominations and wins. And after the full ensemble cast from the original series' its final bow out in 1981 Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country, Paramount Pictures eventually come up to TNG executive producer and showrunner Rick Berman and kind of said, we want to do a feature film based on the Next Generation cast. And so this happened around season 6 or so, about the midway point of that season. And Burton said, well, let me bring in regular series co-producers and writers, Ronald D. Moore and Brannon Braga, to kind of develop the whole thing. And you think that'd be kind of a long time to kind of do it, because they're like, okay, we're doing season 6 right now, we're going to project out, we're going to end this thing around the end of season 7. So you got about a year and a half to kind of work on this whole thing, but they still got to keep working on the entire series. They still have numerous credits throughout the rest of season 6 and into season 7, doing a lot of story credits and actual teleplay. So they're juggling a lot of different things, still working on regular weekly episodes. And then, while they're actually writing the actual final drafts or whatnot for the feature film, they get handed the full feature-length series finale, All Good Things, to develop and write, which also contains a lot of time travel elements. A lot of other things that are very much like they got so jumbled up to a certain degree. We're trying to develop both screenplays at the exact same time, and having a lot of different problems. Like there's certain points in time, it's like, which screenplay are we working on? Are we working on the teleplay? Are we working on the feature film screenplay? Which one are we working on right now? What scene did this script go into? So they were very much privileged. They felt very honored to be working on both things, were just monumental things overall. But it did kind of feel like the series finale of All Good Things went off so much better. They just went off on a better quality story. They felt they had more ability to kind of iron out things, kind of work on that much more focus to a certain degree. One for Generations has gotten a lot of criticism over the years, and they definitely feel like they didn't quite nail things as strongly or as solidly as they possibly could. And so there's a lot of interesting things involved with that thing, because they end the series in April of 1994 and they go right in production on the film, which is going to be out in theaters in November of 1994. So they had about 6 months from the beginning of filming in the whole thing to when it's going to be in the theaters completed and all that type of stuff. So it's a very rushed schedule. It's a very rushed type of thing where you really wouldn't see a big budget type of film like this costing $35 million, which is a little bit of a bump up from where they were on Star Trek VI, where I think it was roughly about $29 million they kind of worked on the entire film. This one definitely is kind of bumping it up and trying to be much more ambitious to a certain degree and just like really want to jump it out there. And it's like, this is kind of like major peak for the entire franchise. You got, again, Next Gen going big on the theatrical screen. They're going into season 3 of Deep Space Nine, and they're launching Voyager, which ends up being a massive undertaking, a massive piece of production nightmares on the whole thing, where they actually had to recast the lead of Janeway and a whole bunch of things. Just like it made out to be a massively costly pilot that had to produce for the whole thing. So they've got a lot of wheels turning in this whole thing, a lot of things going into production, a lot of things just all over the place, just like at the mass capacity of everything they could possibly do on production level. They are into it at this point in time in 1994. And the director they trusted to update everything for the big screen here was David Carson, who had been doing television work for the last 12 years, but he directed 4 different episodes of The Next Generation, including yesterday's Enterprise, one of the absolute best episodes of the entire series, and directed the Deep Space Nine pilot, Emissary, which is also a fantastic piece of work. So they got someone who could really nail the Star Trek vibes and dramatic sensibilities of the entire series and amplify it for the big screen, but they had to kind of update a lot of different things, and to make it big screen worthy, they had to update a lot of the different sets. Bridge of the Enterprise D gives a whole new makeover. The command chairs are now on an elevated riser, and there's some additional computer workstations along the side of the bridge to give it a little bit more activity for the cinemascope frame. And of course they revamped the lighting and kind of gave Worf his own chair now at the tactical station, so did some very particular improvements to just make it look more impressive for that widescreen presentation. Also, they brought in a really acclaimed cinematographer, John A. Alonso. This guy had shot The Magnificent Seven, Chinatown, Scarface, Blue Thunder, a lot of different films, just like really just stunning films to a certain degree. And he came in and did a fantastic job to update, not make it look like, oh, we just slapped a TV episode up on the big screen. No, we got a cinematographer here that can shoot a film. And he just shoots this thing absolutely gorgeously, just like everything he does just on the Enterprise, just make it look like painting with light so much. Just everything to do with the warm sun glow on the whole thing, the amber glow where they're near the Amagosa Observatory and getting the sunlight pouring in, everything looks absolutely just fantastically beautiful. All these different things, just like he does such a great job that the entire film, just using light and shadow in some dangerous situations up there on the observatory, stuff like that. And he's giving different things, like when they get into the Nexus fantasy sequences with Picard and whatnot, just looks absolutely warm glows. Everything looks so beautiful and all these different things. Just like they really took the sets, updated them, make them look more interesting on that regard to hold up to much bigger scrutiny, and just had a fantastic cinematographer come in to make this thing look just stunning, striking so much as all the visuals come out so beautifully through the entire film. Just looks so much like a major theatrical cinematic upgrade on so many different levels here, but they had some other sort of production issues getting up to the whole thing, showing a little bit of the hand towards the rush production schedule to here, because they originally intend to update the uniforms for the Starfleet officers. They're going to have a very much a revamped look at this whole thing, but it didn't quite work out because they only got up to about 1 or 2 days of production, then absolutely scrapped the whole thing, because, as Robert Blackman, the regular series costume designer since season 3, said they looked very good on paper, getting all the sketches and all the type of stuff, the concept drawings gone out, but when they kept doing fittings and stuff like that, it's like everything just never quite looked right. They just could never tweak it to make it kind of work in certain ways, and the only footage we found is some very rough-looking work print VHS footage, which was provided by Trek Core, released several years ago, just showing LeVar Burton in the sequence where he gets abducted by the Klingons. Just a little bit of thing there with this sort of double-breasted tunic, very much similar to the ones that were adopted in Wrath of Khan for the original series cast there. Kind of have that sort of flap there, kind of different things here and there, and of course, they had to get these designs out kind of early for Playmates, who did all the toys for the entire Star Trek line here, to get it up to the point where they could design it and manufacture it and get it up on the shelves by the time the film got released in the theaters. So those are the only real official way to actually see what they originally intended to do. And of course, there are other like Star Trek art books that kind of put out, that kind of had a little bit more of the designs here and there, but they kind of like, well, saying they kind of tipped his hand towards everyone, like, that doesn't look like any uniforms we've seen in Star Trek up to this point. They obviously designed the whole thing, didn't work out very well, and kind of scrapped things, and that's why you've got this weird mix of the next-gen kind of tunics, and then you got these sort of more kind of jumpsuit types of things from Deep Space Nine, and Jonathan Frakes is wearing Avery Brooks's uniform, and LeVar Burton is wearing Cole Meany's uniform, and they don't fit quite right, because you can see the sleeves on Jonathan Frakes are all rolled up, and obviously it's very ill-fitting on LeVar Burton. And so because they didn't feel like the next-gen uniforms would hold up on the big screen, because they were never screen tested for that. So they always were just like back on the analog TV sets. They worked up just fine by projecting them on a big screen, on full resolution film and stuff like that. They didn't feel confident they would work out that regard. And of course, they had such a narrow window to work on things from the end of the series into the film. It kind of ended up in a jumbled mess. They kind of like scrambled, like, okay, we're going to have this guy wearing this uniform, the other guys wearing the other uniforms, and apparently only Patrick Stewart and presumably Brent Spiner got actual tailored uniforms for themselves to make sure they looked very well for the length of screen time they'd be wearing on screen. And so it's a bit of a jumbled mess in that regard, and kind of shows his hand towards how the production got a little bit rushed and kind of like ran into things too quickly. If they had more time, they could have finessed things, do more screen tests, kind of work things out, and kind of figured out exactly what they would have done overall with the costume design of the whole film. But moving into this cast that just translates so very well to the big screen here, starting out with Patrick Stewart as Captain Jean-Luc Picard. Very interesting to go with this type of story for the character. Something that's very kind of like deeply personal, something very intimate for the character here to deal with, having his brother Robert and his nephew Rene perish in a fire. Just like it hits very deeply to the soul of the character here. That's never been too dealt with in the entire series. It's kind of like maybe lightly touched on here and there, but not so much to this degree here. That sadly, unfortunately, they didn't bring back the same actors who portrayed the characters of Robert and Rene back in the episode Family, which is a fantastic episode and kind of a lost type of thing to not bring those actors back in such very impactful roles they had on that episode, and very much on the character of Jean-Luc Picard as well. Very much a missed opportunity that very kind of degrades the emotional impact that you have in the entire film. Showing photos of characters, but they're completely recast or not recognizable. It would hit so much harder if you did get those actors back to kind of fill those roles again. If you had Robert come back in that fantasy sequence on the Nexus and stuff like that, would have added something a little extra to the entire story here. But just having a story that kind of delves into that whole type of thing, the family dynamic, the thing that now weighs on him so much that he never pursued a family and never has that lineage to follow on at this point in time. So it's an interesting thing to get into the heart of the character that was never terribly deeply explored before, but still kind of rings to a certain degree. It rings well enough to the character that Stewart is phenomenal. Just phenomenal in these moments that you see that depth of pain where he's there with Counselor Troy and that in his quarters and whatnot. It's superb acting. You can't find better acting than this in any regard, in any type of way, just like he just delivers it with such deep pathos to the character, that type of stuff. But I just like that whole thing early on in the film where we don't get revealed what the situation is. You just see his reaction when he gets the message in the holodeck, and he's kind of being very short and very kind of preoccupied with Riker or whatnot in these different moments, and especially that moment in 10 Forward when he confronts Soren, and Soren has that line, literally a line, "Time is the fire in which we burn." The emotional reaction, the depth and whatnot that's going on in his performance here is just riveting. And then once you get that sequence where he's talking to Troy and stuff like that, and you get further exploration of this as it weaves back around later on in the film, it's a fantastic performance. I think just does a magnificent job just showing all those layers of the character here that Picard's usually pretty guarded with his emotions as the captain of the vessel. Doesn't really kind of go off and kind of like express that so much to the crew or whatnot. So you get these little intimate moments here to show a little bit more depth to the character here. Something that can swirl around in him, kind of push him towards an end where that is thematically in line with everything that's going on with Soren. He lost family and stuff like that, and he's kind of become this megalomaniacal villain, and he's doing it all just to get a little piece of that family dynamic he used to have back that the Borg took away from him, stuff like that. So it still rings true to the thematic elements of the entire film. Even if you kind of feel like when he gets in the Nexus, that doesn't really feel like where Picard would want to go in, though it makes sense for the story is where he's kind of mentally at that point in time. So it kind of like weaves into the immediacy of the plot, but like so much like when you get into the stuff with Kirk in the Nexus, doesn't quite feel like that defines who the character is. It really represents who the character is. Where they would feel the most at home at, most content with, doesn't quite feel in the full tapestry of their characters where it seems to fit in so much with the legacy of who they are, what defines them, and what really brings them to the full fruition of who they are, what drives them, what is the most central thing to their character. So very debatable in that regard, seeing this kind of Charles Dickens-esque Christmas Carol sort of lush type of setting for him. Just like, it seems a little not entirely Picard. As he's going through the series, started out very curmudgeonly about kids, stuff like that. He's kind of softened and grown and warmed up over time, whatnot. So a little more dynamic as he's grown to that degree, but it was never quite that sensibility of having his own children, his own family, stuff like that. So the immediacy of the plot brings that to the forefront, but doesn't feel like overall with the full lineage of this character feels quite on the money what you would kind of expect for the character in that regard here. But I think Stewart does a fantastic job bringing the character to life in the big screen, really delivers it so very well here. But get a little bit of a turn towards the comedic side here when you get the whole thing with Data here, Brent Spiner portraying the character again, delving into the emotionship with something that came up with his brother Lore or whatnot that's been explored here and there, apparently coming back in the new series of Picard, stuff like that. But he's a fantastic comedic actor. You've seen that if you watch Night Court, his character of Bob Wheeler on that thing, he was absolutely brilliant in the whole thing. And of course, it's a much more outlandish role in Independence Day. A couple things here and there. He's a fantastic comedic actor. He can deliver it so much, but it does feel a little bit over the top, a little bit out of line with the tone of the rest of the film, but just kind of lead on to a certain degree in terms of like the chip malfunctioning when they're on the observatory with Geordi, stuff like that. So it kind of feeds into it, but it feels a little overly jokey. It feels like there could be a little bit more depth of nuance in some places. It still has those moments where it kind of deals with the emotional state of kind of like grief and sort of remorse and stuff like that when he's in the stellar cartography and dealing with Picard and having that scene there. It does bring a dramatic moment to the entire thing, but it's still kind of like veers off to the comedy stuff, a little bit more over the top type of stuff in those regards, where he's kind of humming and singing and whatnot on the bridge and stuff like that. And it's very entertaining in sort of a popcorn movie type of way, but it feels kind of out of step a little bit. Not as bad as some like the comedy they try to get away with in Star Trek V, but it's still something that feels a little jarring towards the tone and the style of the entire film. So still very well executed. It just feels like it just doesn't quite line up. And of course the data emotion chip plot as a kind of a TV-esque sort of B plot sort of thing is like it's something running parallel to the rest of the main plot, but really doesn't have much integration or really kind of consequence towards the main plot of the entire thing. Fantastic performance from Spiner. Just feels like they didn't quite get as much of a handle to integrate that to the thematic elements of this story here in general here, but everyone else in the entire cast, even though they don't get a lot, they still bring everything very well. They didn't write a lot of things for Riker and Troy and Crusher and Worf and Geordi and whatnot to really kind of do as much in the entire film, but they still add in little things here and there to just make them part of the whole here. That feels very much integrated so well. It still feels very much on the money for what the series was. And so very nice getting Barbara March and Gwynyth Walsh back in here as the Duras sisters. And it's kind of great having them come in as pre-established characters here with a history with the Enterprise D crew, but you don't have to go into a long backstory explaining their history with the Klingon politics and the Romulan conspiracy, stuff like that. They're just kind of nice to add in there as sort of like accomplices to Soren's plan with their own kind of machinations, stuff like that. So it really kind of aids the film to be kind of a nice, convenient shorthand to kind of move the plot forward. And they do a fantastic job. They're always so deliciously treacherous to a certain degree. Just like they have such a delightfully evil quality. They're always great about playing it up, getting their dynamics right between the two of them, Lursa and B'Etor, and working out things with Picard and stuff like that. Always great. They're just a very good thing to have on screen. Don't have to set up brand new villains that kind of have too much going on where you don't develop them as much. They're very well developed characters. The actresses go into the roles. They know exactly what they're doing. So everything comes off very well. It comes very much a shorthand you have with the rest of the regular series cast. Bring them in. They've already done a couple episodes here and there. They're on Deep Space Nine for a stint. Do a fantastic job. Just have them in their swan song of the entire franchise here. Do a fantastic job in that regard. But of course you get Malcolm McDowall here, just a fantastic, legendary actor going back to stuff Clockwork Orange and a million other things. And he's actually the uncle of Deep Space Nine actor Alexander Siddig, who portrays Dr. Julian Bashir. So kind of a nice thing in that regard here. And I think it was the fact that Patrick Stewart was actually a friend of his, like long ago, back in the 60s. They did some stage plays, stuff like that together. So they're very much connected, and pretty much Stewart just said, check out Malcolm McDowall. He'd be a perfect fit for this type of character or anything like that. And the interesting thing with Soren here is that they set up a very good character that has a little bit of a tinge towards Star Trek history here, having his world ravaged by the Borg and lost his entire family, and having that connection with Guinan there. They're part of the same race. And we've already got such a great thing with Whoopi Goldberg establishing this character since season 2, and just everything going off in that regard just has a great sensibility, having her a bit of a link from 23rd century to the 24th century, have all these different things kind of work in tandem and stuff like that. But it's a good performance, but the fact is that you got this entire backstory of the character here that is trying to regain this moment of just pure ecstasy to a certain degree, just to be reunited with such an illusion of his family. He's been hit with this tragedy. He's been have all the stuff ripped away from this malevolent species, all these different things, and he's spent decades trying to formulate a way just to get back to the Nexus, just to get that sensibility, that sense of pure joy back to him. Feels like there should be a tragic element of the character being played up somewhere, more depth, more layers with the character that feels more emotionally fractured. It feels like you really need to have more of that sensibility. I feel like it kind of reflects off to his Voyager episode called Hope and Fear, where this character portrayed by Ray Wise fantastically has kind of the exact same backstory. His world is ravaged by the Borg. He's like the last survivor of his entire race, and he kind of concocts his entire revenge plot to kind of launch the crew of Voyager over into Borg space to be actually captured and assimilated, stuff like that. Plays a lot more of those elements to such a great degree on that episode. You can see much more of the tragic, kind of desperate qualities of the character. Malcolm McDowall, as the character is portrayed here, just feels like he's just a malevolent villain with no other depth to the character. Just like he's here to do something, he doesn't care about the consequences, stuff like that. Just feels like there needs to be more texture, more layers to the character to play here, to have that emotional base to play out the whole thing, to see what the character, the person that he was before this tragedy happened, and how everything crusted over the top of it to make him into this much more vile person in a certain way. So it's like, it works as a great villain to a certain degree, just being a foil for the whole thing. It was a great performance in that regard, just being an antagonistic character that has a great screen presence, but it feels like there just needs to be more exploration of the depth of the character towards the backstory and what his motivations were from an emotional standpoint. But shifting back to the 23rd century setting on the Enterprise B, kind of a number of interesting things. Speaking of Voyager, you got Tim Russ kind of having a little extra role in this whole thing right before he had become Tuvok on Voyager. And also had been some roles on Deep Space Nine and Next Generation already. So I believe he actually auditioned for the role of Geordi LaForge back at the beginning of the series. Obviously, eventually got his entire legacy his own on Voyager here. But it was the interesting thing that, first off, Leonard Nimoy was approached to direct his film. But because they were on such a crunch of time, he wasn't able to be given the ability to make changes to the script that he wanted to. So it really kind of like felt like it wasn't for him. And also the fact that the stuff they wrote for Spock, because it was originally going to be Kirk, Spock, and McCoy on the Enterprise B here. But Nimoy felt like they really didn't write anything very much pertinent to Spock, to his character or anything like that. It felt like the dialogue was very interchangeable with anyone else you want to throw in the whole thing. And sadly, DeForest Kelley, his health wasn't the best at the time, and of course would pass away in 1999, and so he wasn't able to get insurance to be on the film, so they had to substitute James Stewart and Walter Koenig as Scotty and Chekhov, the whole thing. So they're always good characters, but you can never deny the quality of that trinity, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, having that reverence, especially in this entire situation here where Kirk is going to be essentially presumed dead. Having those characters there would add that gravity, that pathos to the entire thing. Having those characters there, just like, it would just deepen the entire situation there. And of course, as Next Gen already showed, they already had Bones showed up in Encounter of Farpoint, the pilot. You had James Doohan as Scotty show up later in Relics, and in between those two, Spock showed up on Unification. So those characters are already available and alive in the 24th century, and they were supposed to have a memorial service for Kirk at the end of the film that would have had those characters come back and stuff like that. But one, obviously they couldn't get the actors because of certain situations with the entire production, and they didn't have the money for it. But apparently, I think it was in the novelization that sequence did appear. But the entire thing getting up to here is that the fact that we have James T. Kirk, William Shatner, return for the role in his final appearance. And so it's the interesting thing that they wanted to have this entire kind of like the baton pass the torch type of thing, marry the two timelines in some type of way, and though they're separated by nearly 80 years, kind of a difficult type of thing to have a little bit of a Kirk in his prime, or at least even somewhere close to even past his prime, not have him as like 130 years old like Bones was. I want to have him in a certain context in this whole thing, so how to do the entire time travel manipulation type of things and stuff like that. It's the entire thing. Is Kirk necessary for this entire story to happen? He's not. In my opinion, there's no necessity for Kirk being in this story. There's nothing, I feel, in this story that really demands his presence or further deepens his character or further adds something more to the legacy of his character. Obviously, the entire story here, he dies at the end of this whole thing in a sort of a sacrifice to a certain degree. That a lot of people have been, this is the main debate point in the entire film. Did Kirk have to die? Is it a good death? Was it a good scene? Did everything come off very well? Because there's a lot of different things involved in the entire thing where they actually reshot the entire end of the film. Because the original ending, the thing was like Kirk gets shot in the back by Soren, and people felt it was very much like unsatisfying. So Paramount gave the filmmakers a whole bunch of money to go off and reshoot the entire thing where they had to go all the way back out to the Valley of Fire. Tells you about the hospitable conditions they had in that regard, where when they were originally shooting there, it was 110 degrees, and you can kind of see as the scenes are going on, Patrick Stewart is getting very tanned. Very, very tanned. And then they go back months later, which a little bit cooler months, got down to about 80 degrees, so comparatively a little bit more tolerant in that regard, but had to go back, reshoot the whole thing, had to rebuild entire parts of the sets they built on the whole thing, where originally they took them weeks or months to get them done. They had to get them done within like a couple of days. And so it was a very demanding type of thing. They reshot the entire thing with the entire thing on the bridge sequence and stuff like that. Thinking that would be more sort of satisfying big action climax to the entire thing. But of course, people still had problems. They still just didn't feel like it had the catharsis to it. Because, of course, the pinnacle of the entire thing is going back to Wrath of Khan, seeing what Spock did in the whole thing to sacrifice himself. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. The entire thing sets up a very thematic element to the entire course of the film here. And just getting into the whole thing where he sacrifices himself to save his friends, save the crew, save the ship, everything like that. It has an emotional power to it. But how they do it with Kirk just doesn't feel like it has that sensibility. It even goes back to Star Trek V saying that Bones and Spock's like, I knew it wouldn't die out there in the mountain because I had my friends. I always knew I would die alone. And so some people might not have as much reverence for that, but it still has a sensibility towards it that I've always felt was very true to the character. You always die alone because if he always had his friends there, anyone to count on, they would never let him down. So that always felt very true to me in that regard. And having this start sequence here, it's a fine action sequence, but it feels like there's not as much, again, catharsis. There's not as much poignancy to the end of Kirk here. It just feels like it could have been anyone plugged into the whole thing. Same thing as what Nimoy said about Spock, how they wrote him the entire thing. It doesn't really feel like it demands that character's presence the entire film. It just feels like it's tacked onto it just to make him part of the film. Shatner still does a very good performance here. Just like there's a lot of points on that Enterprise B bridge. He's a little restless. Like we established so much. Him being in that captain's chair is exactly where he needs to be. That's his main driving force. That's where he feels alive. That's where he feels in control. That feels where he actually has that purpose. And that does factor in back when he ends up talking with Picard later on. If you're on the bridge of that ship, if you're in that captain's chair, you can make a difference. That's what drives him so much. So that shows at the beginning of the film, shows up there near the end of the film. It kind of fits in with the idea of Kirk and stuff like that. He's got a good handle on the character here. It's not kind of falling off in any type of way. Of course, again, like I said, the Nexus fantasy sequence feels a little weird. Again, talking about all that type of stuff, it's like his first fantasy sequence, the thing he just drives towards is like him at a log cabin with this unknown woman, and no one knows who the fuck Antonia is. She's just randomly created this entire film. They didn't decide to go with Carol Marcus or anything like that. They have a much more poignancy towards the history of Kirk in any type of way, because it feel like it would hit the money more. It feel like have more emotional resonance if it was much more along that regard, and so just making up some random woman we never learned anything about at this point in time, where he kind of considered leaving Starfleet, which was never anything we ever explored with the character of Kirk before. So that just doesn't quite land, doesn't feel quite like it's true to the character. And to boil it down, a lot of people are upset about the whole thing, killing off Kirk, stuff like that. I feel I'm not upset so much by it. I just feel like it's just mishandled. It's not well handled. It's not resonant. People don't look back on it as the death of other characters you've had in the franchise, stuff like that. It just feels like it's just kind of a hollow moment, especially when you're burying them under a pile of rocks on an abandoned, desolate planet. It's like, again, like I said, they were supposed to have a big memorial service back at Starfleet headquarters, stuff like that, but it always kind of like nudged me the wrong way. It's like this renowned Starfleet captain that's been presumed dead for 78 years. Picard just leaves him under a pile of rocks somewhere. It all just feels very off the mark. Just doesn't feel right to a certain degree. But I think almost like him dying, saving the Enterprise B is much more of a noble end with a lot more poignance to his character than they do when he gets on Viridian 3 and dealing with Soren and stuff like that. I feel like it's much more impactful saving the Enterprise B than it is saving the millions of lives on the other planet that we never end up seeing or knowing anything about. So it's a very exceptional cast with some very good performances, but some fundamental character and screenplay issues I feel like could have been ironed out to be much more solid overall. But someone else coming over the entire series was composer Dennis McCarthy here, and he had done 88 episodes of TNG, go on to do 77 episodes of Deep Space Nine, along with composing their main theme, and going on to do a lot of other Star Trek series after this. But they originally wanted Jerry Goldsmith to come back. But he was doing 5 different films that year of 1994, and really was unavailable to do it, so McCarthy was very much honored and had the guy to kind of get upgraded for everything like that, and very privileged type of thing for him to come into this whole thing. And feeling a certain amount of pressure on the whole thing. Kind of went back and looked what Goldsmith did, what James Horner had done, kind of studied that type of stuff, and most of the entire thing is very much kind of faithful to everything he was doing on the series. Very much in line with that, and kind of ticking it up a few notches, probably having a bigger orchestra or some other things like that. A little more time to work with everything, but it's a weird thing where the main theme he puts together this whole thing just, it never really feels like it hits right. It feels more Deep Space Nine to me, with a little bit of like Bill Conti's score from Masters of the Universe added in there. It's like just something in the makeup of it just sounds like it's an approximation of Goldsmith. Is trying to dance around it without trying to like directly copy him. It's a very weird type of thing. It's like every time Goldsmith isn't doing the score, no one wants to reuse his themes. There's never any consistency. So like every time there's a new composer, they want to throw everything out and kind of do their own thing. Here, McCarthy's trying to do something similar to Goldsmith, trying to fall in line with it, but doesn't want to reuse his themes, even though they use the damn theme that he composed for the motion picture for every episode of Next Generation in the opening credit sequence. So it's like, why wouldn't you just continue to use that? Maybe do a new orchestration, new arrangement, something else like that. Why just throw it all out and just not do it at all? It feels such a weird type of thing to do that. Thankfully, Goldsmith would come back for the next 3 Next Generation films, but it's just that main theme that never feels right to me. It just feels like it's just off the mark. It just never settles in with me the right way. But all the other cues in the entire thing feel exactly what he was doing on the entire series. So, in that regard, pretty good thing. You can get the original soundtrack release is still available. It's on streaming platforms, on iTunes, you get it on CD. But G&P Crescendo did reissue it as a 2-disc expanded edition many years ago. You can get that on CD and also stream it in some place, but you cannot buy it on iTunes, unfortunately. But definitely worth checking out if you're very much a hard fan of this score from Dennis McCarthy. But the effects work on Star Trek Generations is absolutely fantastic. I was talking about the makeup effects from Michael Westmore. The guy had garnered Emmy nominations for every single season of the Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Enterprise, and getting 4 nominations off of Voyager, plus getting Oscar nominations for his makeup effects work on Star Trek First Contact, Clan of the Cave Bear, Mask, and 2010, the year we made contact. So this guy absolutely one of the absolute best in the field, and so much of just the alien designs and so many other things involving the makeup effects in Star Trek are so much to his credit from 1987 onwards. Fantastic work. It does such a great job here realizing all the Klingons. You even got Brian Thompson, who had done another stint as a Klingon in Star Trek back in, I believe, season 2, coming back in this whole thing as part of the Duras sisters' entire crew, and just a lot of different makeup effects and stuff like that. Even though you got Soren, who's just got a little scar on him, not too many things involved with a lot of main characters, but still maintains the absolute highest quality possible. He did with Worf and Data and all these different things going on the entire thing. All the background players are playing alien characters. Just top-notch, incredible type of work from him. But these special visual effects and all the type of stuff, handled by Industrial Light Magic, coming back, it's like every time it was ILM, you knew the work was going to be fantastic, and here is no difference whatsoever. Still following on for their ambitious, innovative work on Star Trek VI, mirroring all the practical model effects with brand new CGI stuff, and doing all that innovative types of things with the Nexus there to kind of make it much more than just an electrical disturbance. They want to have more of a interesting life to it to a certain degree, almost organic to a certain degree, but they really want to just challenge themselves further to show you something you can't quite see yet on the screen, and marrying that with both a practical model of the Enterprise B, which is kind of an update of the old Excelsior model, and just kind of mirroring that in with digital visuals and stuff like that to really just make such a spectacular opening sequence there. Just like so much delivers and so much holds up after all this point in time. It's like having the fact that they had to bring out the old 6-foot model of the Enterprise D, which was made all the way back at the beginning of the series. Had to do a lot of refurbishing, a lot of repainting, just touch-ups here and there, and kind of replace some of the electricals inside the entire model to kind of replace lights in and stuff like that to really get up to snuff so they could photograph it the best way possible, because they made like a 2-foot model, 4-foot model as the series went on, but they felt like you want to get up on this anamorphic CinemaScope frame up on the big screen. They felt like the 6-foot model would hold up the best, having the most surface area, the most detail, stuff like that, to really kind of make it look that good. They really had to construct a much more enlarged version of it for the crash sequence later on in the film. especially when the thing is barreling forward, and again, these kind of close-ups of the front end of the entire ship. They really just did an enlarged version of the whole thing, and the whole thing of just doing that entire crash, they had to create this entire massive model set of just the planet's surface there to have it crash into and do some very interesting techniques. It's like, as this thing is kind of charging towards the camera, charging into the frame, they actually shot it through a mirror. So the enlarged model of the Enterprise D saucer section is charging forward towards this mirror, which is going to crash through, but the camera is safely out of danger, able to capture this fantastic shot. And they put together some very impressive pyrotechnics throughout the entire film, plus their stunt team is at the absolute top of their game, especially when they're up there in Valley of Fire and stuff like that, and everyone's kind of having to take falls on all these rocks and everything like that. I do not envy the stunt team whatsoever. They might have been busted up quite a bit. Great stunt team, great effects work. The only kind of things that kind of fall off is that they reuse some shots of the Klingon bird of prey from Star Trek VI that really just, they really stick out really badly. They're just so obvious that they took those shots from the other film and just kind of spliced them in there. Maybe they just kind of ran out of time and just couldn't finish it for their effects shots and blow up another model or anything like that. So again, maybe that 6-month turnaround from beginning of production to release may have hindered things just a tad bit on that regard. But everything else in terms of the effects on the film are just absolutely outstanding. They just hold up completely to this day. But looking at the end result here of Star Trek Generations, a film that, like I said, cost about $35 million to produce, but garnered $118 million back at the worldwide box office, which pretty much outperformed Star Trek VI, which garnered about $97 million of a $30 million budget. So pretty much did attract a lot more attention, especially like Kirk's in this whole thing, meeting Next Generation, stuff like that. But views weren't quite as strong. They're a little dodgy, a little divisive in some regards here and there. Some people didn't feel like it hit off very well. It wasn't as coherent of a story. And it's the rush production schedule, stuff like that, and the hindrances that went along with the screenwriters not being able to devote as much time and attention to one single project to make it the absolute best it possibly could. Just leaves a lot of character elements and plot details and story elements just fairly undefined and underdeveloped to make the film function as solidly as it possibly could. It's like the Nexus is such this abstract sort of nebulous concept. It's like such a nothing thing in the film. It's like it has no beginning or end point or any kind of like rules of how it functions. Like, is it a surreal dimension? Is it time travel? I mean, where do you go when you get sucked up by this thing? It's just like, it just doesn't function as a thing in the plot should function. It's just like it's there just to facilitate whatever you want to do with it in the plot. Like, usually like Star Trek, if you come across a certain like spatial anomaly or something else like that, there's some scientific conjecture about what it does and how it functions and stuff like that, what it can and can't do. It's not a very well-defined concept is the point of the whole thing, and just the fact that the structure of the entire film is it's just a little weird. It feels kind of like going through almost like a TV episode structure, and then it gets up to the point where everything happens on Viridian 3, then it segues into the Nexus thing, and then just jumps out and redoes the entire, like, almost like a double third act type of thing, where it's like you have everything that happened on Viridian 3 and the Klingon battle and stuff like that, then you replay the whole thing at the end. It just feels a little weird in how everything's structured out. It even has a kind of this odd sort of like captain's log right in the middle of the film here, where it's like usually used to like you come back from the commercial break and get caught up with the plot if you kind of miss something here and there. This kind of sums up where the plot is coming to this point in time and whatnot. So it's a weird type of thing where they actually did have a deleted scene in sickbay kind of explaining where the plot was, where Data's motion chip kind of fused in his head, stuff like that. So I'm not really sure why they cut that and decided to just plop in a captain's log to kind of fill the plot in a certain way. It's such a very weird type of thing. It's still an entertaining film. I like the fact that it kind of does feel like a big screen version of the series. I always get that kind of nagging thing. It's like, man, I kind of want to watch like the Enterprise D in this CinemaScope format. It's the fantastic cinematography they have in the whole thing, how they're photographing the whole thing, the kind of upgrades they make to the sets. I kind of want to go back to it every so often. It's like I really want to see those visuals, that quality, and just have that sort of sensibility, like the same cast and the same setting, but they're kind of upgraded to a certain degree. And some other things, like there's a certain quality about the film that is very much inviting and appealing and whatnot. It's, even though it's like wonky concepts and things don't quite shore up to their best degrees in certain ways, so I feel you can shoot a lot of different holes in, and like there's little things like even though the Klingons figure out the shield frequency of the Enterprise D, we've seen, especially with the whole things with the Borg and everything like that, they've been able to modulate shield frequencies and stuff like that. That's not employed here. It's like they kind of forget certain things as they go along, and there's like, you always kind of note, like, why does Picard not have his comm badge when he beams down to the surface? Everyone thought like he gets beamed over to the Klingon ship, then they probably took his comm badge and then beamed him down, but it's the Enterprise transporter effect. It's actually because they actually forgot to pack that part of the wardrobe when they went off to the Valley of Fire, so Patrick Stewart didn't have a comm badge, so they just kind of, well, we're kind of screwed anyway. We can't do anything about it, so we'll just kind of nudge it off to the side and not address it. So it's kind of an odd type of thing in that regard. So there's little flaws here and there, the costuming issues and various other things, like certain things kind of hit off and get some holes here and there. And like I said, there are concepts in this thing that are good. The whole thing about living in the now and learning to cherish the time you have because it'll never come again. But you could see other things, like the thing like not living in a fantasy that was very much done as a Reginald Barclay episode, Hollow Pursuits, kind of dealing with that concept. Someone who's living in a fantasy world, you kind of draw yourself back into reality, dealing with the immediacy of the situation, stuff like that. So certain other things like something else similar to the Nexus. There was a Voyager episode called Bliss. They get kind of trapped in this sort of organic anomaly that keeps feeding them like joyous illusions, stuff like that, to kind of trick them into like staying inside this whole thing. So even that Deep Space Nine pilot Emissary has almost the exact same story with Soren transplanted onto Commander Benjamin Sisko, who he lost his wife to the Borg at Wolf 359, and his entire arc in the episode is trying to come to terms with the fact that he never moved on from that point forward. He's been kind of trapped by the trauma of that moment and goes through the entire catharsis of the entire situation, trying to confront that. So all that's in that episode from the same director, along with the wormhole and the celestial temple and the prophets and whatnot, being kind of a really more deeply well-defined aspect of the entire story than the Nexus was, but serving much more of a similar function, but a much more deeper spiritual type of fashion there, tied in with the Bajoran fate. So it's a lot of different things here and there that kind of like have been addressed in Star Trek before and after this. It kind of hit it a bit more, pinpointed it right on the head, and it's a thing that has a lot of good ideas. They're not quite as unique as they could be to this film, and they're executed by very fantastic actors and very skilled director, a very fantastic cinematographer with fantastic effects, and a pretty damn good score. So by no means it's one of the worst Star Trek things ever created. I think it still has a lot of good merit. It just has a lot of errors to it. It's just like some missteps here and there and things that just weren't able to give in their most dedicated attention to really iron out everything to make it the most substantive and most on-point type of concepts you could possibly get for these characters in these situations. So I still think it's a very good film that has a lot of good qualities to it. So guys, really like to hear what your thoughts are about Star Trek Generations, and of course you can go back and watch all my reviews of all the other original cast films. You can watch my review already for First Contact that I did about 2 years ago. But I feel like kind of going back just a tad bit, just stepping back a little bit and kind of looking at this debut for the Next Gen cast was kind of an appealing concept to me. So I'd like to hear what your thoughts are and stuff like that. There's always the Patreon to contribute something every month to get a little extra incentive and a little bit more support for the channel here. And of course, you can also support the channel by liking, commenting, sharing things around, subscribing if you haven't already, and also the super thanks feature that contribute a little something to any particular videos you feel a little bit more extra enjoyment from. So guys, thank you extremely much. So thanks much, take care, live long and prosper.